The sky over Europe in 1943 was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a domain of freezing temperatures, thin air, and industrialized violence on a scale the world had never seen. High above the cloud layers, formations of massive four-engine bombers traced white contrails across the blue, moving with the slow, inexorable momentum of a freight train. These were the Boeing B-17 flying fortresses. To the public back home in the United States, they were the ultimate symbol of American might. They were invincible juggernauts, bristling with heavy machine guns, designed to fly deep into the heart of the enemy, drop their devastating loads, and fight their way back home. The propaganda reels showed them shrugging off anti-aircraft fire, their crews smiling and confident, their formations tight and impenetrable. The legend was clear. The B-17 was a fortress in the sky, a porcupine of defensive fire that no enemy fighter could approach without being shredded. But the men inside those aluminum tubes knew a different truth. They knew that the legend was fraying at the edges. They knew that the propaganda did not mention the cold that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. It did not mention the terror of the flak bursts that turned steel into shrapnel. And most importantly, it did not mention the one thing that kept every pilot, navigator, and bombardier awake at night: the flaw. The fatal, architectural blindness that the enemy had discovered and was exploiting with ruthless, mathematical precision. The B-17, for all its guns and all its armor, had a glass jaw. And the Luftwaffe pilots, the veterans of the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain, had found it. They weren't attacking from the rear anymore. They weren't diving from above. They were coming from the one place the fortress couldn't fight back. They were coming from the front. To understand the gravity of this situation, we have to transport ourselves back to the airfields of East Anglia in the autumn of 1943. The mood in the barracks was grim. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. Every morning, the engines would roar to life, hundreds of propellers churning the damp English air. They would assemble into their combat boxes, huge formations designed to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was sound on paper. If you put enough .50 caliber machine guns in the sky, pointing in every direction, no fighter plane could survive the zone of destruction. But war is rarely fought on paper. War is fought in the chaos of 3 dimensions, and the German pilots had analyzed the American formation with the cold logic of engineers. They realized that the B-17, particularly the F model, which was the workhorse of the fleet at that time, was heavily defended in the tail, the waist, and the top. But the nose? The nose was a plexiglass greenhouse designed for the bombardier to see the target. It offered a spectacular view, but it offered almost no protection. The defensive armament in the nose of a B-17F consisted of 2 flexible .30 caliber or, in some later cases, .50 caliber machine guns. But they were mounted on the sides, in what were called cheek mounts. They were manually operated. They were awkward to aim. And crucially, they could not be brought to bear directly forward in a concentrated stream. There was a cone of vulnerability, a blind spot dead ahead, 12 o'clock level. The Luftwaffe pilots, flying their agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s and the heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190s, developed a tactic that was as simple as it was terrifying. They would fly miles ahead of the bomber stream, turn around, and fly directly at the lead bombers at a closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. It was a game of chicken played with cannons and machine guns. For the German pilot, it required nerves of steel. He had to hold his course while a massive 4-engine bomber grew rapidly in his windshield. But he knew the math was on his side. He knew that the B-17's nose guns couldn't track him fast enough. He knew that the armor plating on the bomber was designed to stop attacks from the rear, not 20mm cannon shells smashing through the plexiglass nose from the front. The results were catastrophic. The 91st Bomb Group, one of the most storied units in the Air Force, lost 42 aircraft in just 3 weeks. Think about that number. That is over 400 men, pilots, engineers, gunners, navigators, gone. Vanished into the freezing air or reduced to wreckage on the German countryside. The morale was cracking. Crews were writing letters home that they never expected to send. They were packing their belongings before every mission, telling their bunkmates who to give their radios and watches to if they didn't come back. The official reports from command blamed the losses on poor formation flying or inexperienced gunners. They said the crews just needed to hold the box tighter. They said the doctrine was sound. But down on the flight line, amidst the smell of high-octane fuel and engine oil, the men who kept these machines flying knew better. They saw the damage. They saw the shattered nose cones. They saw the blood washed out of the bombardier's compartments. One man, in particular, saw it all, and he decided he had seen enough. His name was Technical Sergeant Hank Miller. Hank Miller was not a pilot. He wasn't an officer. He was a crew chief, a mechanic, a man who spoke the language of pistons, hydraulics, and torque. He was the kind of man who could listen to the idle of a Wright Cyclone radial engine and tell you which cylinder was running lean. He had grease permanently etched into his fingerprints, and a reputation for being able to fix anything that could fly. But Hank Miller was also a man carrying a heavy burden. He had grown up with a kid named Tommy Jenkins. They had played baseball together, fixed up old jalopies together, and enlisted together. Tommy was a staff sergeant, a waist gunner on a B-17 named the Lucky Lady. 2 weeks prior, the Lucky Lady had been on a run over the Ruhr Valley. The formation had been jumped by a squadron of Focke-Wulfs. The German leader had signaled a head-on pass. The Lucky Lady was in the lead element. The German fighters came in four abreast, their wings lighting up with cannon fire. The nose of the Lucky Lady simply disintegrated. There was no defensive fire to deter them. The bombers shuddered, rolled over, and broke apart. There were no parachutes. Hank Miller had stood on the airfield that evening, waiting for a plane that would never return. He had waited until the sun went down and the stars came out, staring at the empty patch of sky where his friend should have been. That night, something in Hank Miller changed. The grief was there, certainly, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard rage. It wasn't just anger at the enemy, it was anger at the machine. He looked at the B-17s sitting on the tarmac, silver giants resting in the moonlight, and he saw them not as fortresses, but as traps. He saw the empty nose sockets where the guns should be. He saw the vulnerability that the engineers back in Seattle had missed. He tried to tell his superiors. He wrote reports. He sketched diagrams on the back of maintenance logs. He argued that the B-17 needed a chin turret, a power-operated gun mount right under the nose to cover the frontal arc. The response was what you might expect from a military bureaucracy in the middle of a world war. He was told to stick to his job. He was told that adding weight to the nose would throw off the center of gravity. He was told that modifying a combat aircraft without authorization was a court-martial offense. He was told that the experts knew what they were doing. But Hank Miller had cleaned the remains of the experts' mistakes out of too many cockpits. He knew that the timeline for a factory modification was months, maybe years. The crews flying tomorrow didn't have years. They barely had hours. The turning point came on a rainy night in October. The airbase was quiet, save for the distant hum of a generator and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the corrugated metal roof of the hangar. Miller was working late, tuning a carburetor on a B-17F named the Iron Maiden. This plane had a bad reputation. It was considered a jinx ship. It had flown 5 missions and had to abort 4 of them due to mechanical failures. The one mission it completed, it came back riddled with holes. The crew was superstitious, fearful, and on the verge of breaking. The pilot of the Iron Maiden, Lieutenant Arthur Reynolds, walked into the hangar. He was young, barely 22, but his eyes looked ancient. Trailing behind him was his bombardier, Sergeant Marcus Bell, a kid who looked like he should still be in high school asking a girl to prom. Bell was shaking. Not shivering from the cold, but shaking with a deep, resonant terror. "We're on the roster for tomorrow, Hank," Reynolds said quietly. His voice was flat, resigned. "Target is Castle. Deep penetration. Fighter territory all the way." Miller didn't look up from the engine. "I'll have the number 3 engine purring by morning, Lieutenant. She'll fly right." "It doesn't matter if she flies right," Bell blurted out. The kid was clutching his flight cap so hard his knuckles were white. If we go up there like this, we're dead. You know the scouting reports. They have 3 wings of fighters massing near the border. They're going to hit us head on. I can't stop them, Hank. I have one gun on a swivel that jams if I look at it wrong. I can't stop a 109 coming at me at 600 miles an hour. I'm just sitting in a glass cage waiting to die. Reynolds stepped closer, putting a hand on the mechanic's shoulder. Hank, I know the regulations. I know what they told you. But you're the best wrench in the 8th. Is there anything at all, you can do? Make us less of a sitting duck. I don't care about the weight. I don't care about the drag. Just give us a fighting chance. Miller stopped working. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and looked at the 2 young men. He saw Tommy Jenkins in their faces. He saw the 100 other faces that hadn't come back. He looked at the nose of the Iron Maiden. That beautiful, transparent, deadly nose. He took a breath, and in that moment he decided to throw his career, his rank, and his freedom away. Get the hell out of here, Miller said. Reynolds blinked, confused. Hank? I said get out. Go to the barracks. Get some sleep. And don't you dare come back into this hangar until pre-flight check at 0500. If anyone asks, you didn't see me. You didn't talk to me. You don't know anything. Reynolds looked at Miller, really looked at him, and saw the glint in the mechanic's eye. He nodded, grabbed Bell by the arm, and dragged him out into the rain. As soon as the hangar doors slid shut, Miller went to work. He didn't go to the supply depot, that would leave a paper trail. He went to the boneyard. The boneyard was the graveyard of bombers, the place where the wrecked carcasses of B-17s that had crash-landed were stripped for parts. In the shadows of the twisted aluminum, Miller found what he needed. He found a crashed B-17 that still had its wing guns intact. He spent the next hour sweating and cursing, wrenching 4 heavy .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns out of the wings. These were not the lightweight, flexible guns usually found in the nose. These were heavy, fixed-mount weapons designed to endure the stress of combat. He dragged them back to the hangar on a sled. Now came the hard part. He had to mount 4 heavy machine guns into the nose of a B-17F, a space designed for a map table and a bomb sight. He needed steel. But not just any steel. He needed 4130 chromoly steel, the kind used in the structural spars of the wings. He found a section of a wing from a C-47 Skitran that had overshot the runway the week before. He spent 2 hours just cutting the metal with an oxyacetylene torch, the blue flame hissing in the silence of the hangar. The heat was intense, sweating through his grease-stained coveralls. He had to be precise. If the cuts were off by even a fraction of an inch, the vibration of the guns would shear the bolts. He measured, marked, cut, and ground the edges smooth. Then came the mounting plate. The floor of the bombardier's compartment was plywood covered in a thin sheet of aluminum. It couldn't hold the weight. Miller ripped it up. He went to the scrap pile again and found a section of armor plating from a half-track vehicle. It was heavy, brutal steel. He cut it to shape and bolted it directly to the fuselage frame, using heavy-gauge aircraft bolts he had hoarded for months. He tightened them until his knuckles cracked, torquing them down to specs that existed only in his head. The guns themselves were a nightmare. The M2 Browning is a beast. It weighs 84 pounds. 4 of them weigh 336 pounds. That's the weight of 2 large men standing on the nose of the plane. Miller had to build a cradle. He welded a box frame, bracing it against the newly installed floor plate. He used the truck springs to create a floating mount. The idea was that when the guns fired, the entire cradle would slide back half an inch against the springs, absorbing the shock before it hit the airframe. It was a crude recoil dampener, the kind of thing you'd see on a piece of farm equipment, not a high-tech bomber. But Miller knew it would work. He greased the slides with heavy graphite lubricant, working it into the metal until the cradle moved smoothly with a heavy, satisfying thunk. The final challenge was the trigger. The bombardier couldn't fire 4 separate guns with his hands while trying to aim. Miller rigged a solenoid system, wiring all 4 guns to a single joystick grip he scavenged from a broken turret. 1 button. 4 guns. Maximum destruction. He wired the solenoids in parallel to a single switch. He tested it with a battery. Click, 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 click. The 4 plungers snapped forward in perfect unison. It was a symphony of mechanical lethality. He soldered the connections, wrapping them in friction tape to prevent shorts from the vibration. He routed the wires along the side of the fuselage, hiding them behind the canvas insulation so the inspectors wouldn't see them at a glance. By 0400, he was exhausted. His eyes were burning, his hands were cut and bleeding, but he was finished. He stepped back to look at his creation. It was ugly. It looked brutal. The barrels of the 4 machine guns jutted out of the nose of the Iron Maiden, like the fangs of a prehistoric beast. It was a violation of every aerodynamic principle and military regulation in the book. It was heavy. It was unapproved. It was insanity. And it was magnificent. When Reynolds and Bell arrived at 0500, they stopped dead in their tracks. They stared at the nose of their aircraft. Bell walked up to the plexiglass and touched the barrels, cold and menacing. He looked back at Miller, who was slumped in a corner, drinking cold coffee. "Hank," Bell whispered. "What is this?" "That," Miller croaked, his voice raspy from the welding fumes, "is your insurance policy. 450s. Fixed forward convergence at 600 yards. 1 trigger. You point the nose at the bad guys, and you hold that button down until they stop moving." Reynolds looked worried. "The weight, will she lift?" "I stripped the armor plating from the radio room and removed the ball turret ammo reserve to compensate," Miller lied. He hadn't removed a thing. "She's heavy, Lieutenant. You'll need every inch of runway. Keep the tail up. But once she's in the air, she'll fly." The mission briefing was standard, but the tension was electric. "Target, the Fiesler Aircraft Works in Kassel. Intelligence reported heavy fighter concentration." The weather was clear, which meant the Luftwaffe would be up in force. As the crews walked out to their planes, other pilots stared at the Iron Maiden. They pointed at the snout, whispering, asking what the hell Reynolds had done to his bird. Reynolds ignored them. He climbed into the cockpit, fired the engines, and felt the heavy vibration of the ship. The takeoff was terrifying. The Iron Maiden was sluggish. She rumbled down the runway, eating up asphalt, refusing to lift. The end of the runway, and the line of trees beyond it, rushed closer. Reynolds pulled back on the yoke with all his strength. "Come on, you heavy pig," he grunted. "Fly." At the very last second, the wheels left the ground. The bomber groaned, clawing for altitude, skimming the treetops. They were up. The climb to 25,000 feet was a slow agony. The formation assembled, a massive stream of bombers stretching for miles. The Iron Maiden held her spot in the low squadron, the Purple Heart corner, usually the most vulnerable position. As they crossed the channel and entered enemy airspace, the temperature inside the plane dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The crew plugged in their heated suits. They checked their oxygen. And they waited. They didn't have to wait long. "Bandits! 12 o'clock level! Hi!" The call came over the intercom, static-laced but frantic. Reynolds looked out his windscreen. There they were. Small black dots against the sun, rapidly turning into silhouettes. The Luftwaffe. A mixed formation of Bf-109s and Fw-190s. They were forming up for a head-on pass. They had picked their target. They were coming straight for the low squadron. Straight for the Iron Maiden. "Here they come!" Reynolds yelled. "Steady, Bell! Wait for it!" In the nose, Sergeant Marty Bell was breathing hard, his breath fogging up the cold glass. He gripped the custom joystick Miller had installed. It felt heavy, solid. Through the new gun sight, he saw the lead German fighter. A yellow-nosed Bf-109. It was growing larger by the second. He could see the muzzle flashes from the German's wings. 20mm shells were already arcing toward them. Usually, this was the moment Bell would close his eyes and pray. Usually, he would fire a few hopeless bursts from his side gun and duck. But not today. Today, he felt the weight of the devil's teeth at his fingertips. "Come on," Bell whispered. "Come on, you fascist bastard! A little closer." The German pilot, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, was confident. He had done this a dozen times. He saw the B-17 in his sights. He knew the nose was weak. He expected to see the few erratic tracers of a single handheld gun. He lined up his shot, ready to rake the cockpit and send the bomber spiraling down. He was closing at 600 miles per hour. 1,000 yards. 800 yards. At 600 yards, Bell squeezed the trigger. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The Iron Maiden didn't just vibrate, she shuddered as if she had hit a brick wall. The roar of the 4.50 caliber machine guns was deafening, drowning out the drone of the engines. A solid, blinding stream of tracers erupted from the nose of the bomber. It wasn't a flickering candle, it was a fire hose of lead. Richter never had a chance to be surprised. One moment, he was lining up a kill. The next, the air in front of him was filled with a dense, inescapable storm of high-velocity metal. The four guns, converging their fire, created a saw blade of destruction. The lead Bf-109 didn't spiral. It didn't smoke. It simply ceased to exist as an aerodynamic form. The stream of bullets sawed the right wing off at the root. The fuel tank exploded. The fighter disintegrated into a cloud of fire and debris. "Got him!" Bell screamed, the adrenaline surging through him. But he didn't let go of the trigger. The German wingman, flying close formation, flew directly into the debris cloud of his leader. Before he could react, Bell shifted his aim slightly. The devil's teeth chewed into the second fighter. The engine block of the 109 was smashed to pieces. The canopy shattered. The plane flipped over and plummeted. The German formation behind them broke discipline. This was impossible. B-17s didn't shoot back like this. They were supposed to be prey. But this bomber was a predator. "Sweep them, Bell! Sweep them!" Reynolds shouted, struggling to keep the plane level against the recoil. Bell swung the joystick left. The stream of fire lashed out like a whip. A Focke-Wulf 190, coming in for a shallow dive, caught the full force of the broadside. The heavy rounds tore through the cockpit and the engine. It spun away, trailing black smoke. For the next 10 minutes, the sky over Kassel became a slaughterhouse. The German fighters, confused and angry, tried to press the attack, assuming the first kills were a fluke. They came in again and again, trying to overwhelm the bomber. And again. The Iron Maiden spit death. Bell fell into a rhythm. Aim. Lead. Fire. The guns thundered relentlessly. The floor of the nose compartment was ankle-deep in spent brass casings. The smell of cordite was overpowering, even through the oxygen mask. The air battle was not just a visual spectacle, it was a physical assault on the senses. The noise inside the Iron Maiden was a chaotic blend of roaring engines, the thumping of the turret guns from the roof and ball, and the unique, jackhammer pounding of the nose quad mount. Every time Bell fired, the planes slowed perceptibly, the recoil acting as a break in the sky. 3 o'clock! Coming around! I see him! Bell swung the nose. Reynolds kicked the rudder to help him line up. The B-17 yawed, bringing the nose guns to bear on a fighter trying to flank them. Bell unleashed a 2-second burst. The fighter's tail section was severed. It tumbled away. The rest of the bomber group watched in awe. They saw the Iron Maiden at the front of the formation, glowing with muzzle flashes. They saw German fighters exploding on approach. They saw the Luftwaffe pilots pull up, break off, and dive away, terrified of the fire-breathing monster in the lead. By the time the formation reached the target, dropped their bombs, and turned for home, the tally was staggering. The German fighter attacks had ceased. The radio chatter from the German pilots, intercepted by intelligence, was filled with panic. Actum! The lead bomber is a trap. Do not approach from the front. It is a flak battery with wings. The flight home was eerily quiet. The Iron Maiden was lighter now, having expended thousands of rounds of ammunition and her bomb load. She flew smoothly. When the coast of England appeared on the horizon, the crew finally exhaled. They landed at the base in the late afternoon. As the Iron Maiden taxied to her hard stand, the ground crews stopped what they were doing. They saw the blackened streaks on the nose. They saw the pile of brass visible through the plexiglass. Miller was waiting. He stood by his toolbox, wiping his hands, looking terrified. If the plane had crashed, it was his fault. If the guns had jammed, it was his fault. Reynolds cut the engines. The props spun down to a halt. The hatch opened. Bell stumbled out first. He looked at Miller. Then, without a word, he walked over and hugged the greasy, exhausted mechanic. He hugged him so hard he lifted him off the ground. 26. Bell sobbed. We counted 26 confirmed, Hank. Maybe more. They fell like flies. We're alive. We're alive. Reynolds climbed down, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. He walked over to Miller. You're going to be in a lot of trouble, Hank, he said, a grin spreading across his face. But you just won the war for us today. The news traveled faster than the speed of sound. The Iron Maiden's impossible defense became the talk of every mess hall in the 8th Air Force. Crews from other groups drove over in jeeps just to look at the Miller mod. They demanded it. Pilots told their crew chiefs, "Get me the devil's teeth, or I'm not flying." Miller, operating in secret at first, then with the tacit, turning a blind eye approval of the squadron commanders, taught other mechanics how to do it. They raided every scrapyard in England. They stole guns. They welded at night. Within weeks, dozens of B-17s were sporting the insane modification. The impact on the air war was measurable. The German head-on tactic, once their trump card, became a suicide run. The survival rate of the bomber crews began to climb. The Luftwaffe was baffled. Their intelligence reports couldn't understand how the Americans had upgraded their entire fleet overnight without a factory recall. Oberleutnant Richter, who had survived the encounter by diving away early, wrote in his diary, "The Americans have suddenly learned to shoot from the front. It is terrifying. The sky has no safe place anymore." Of course, the brass eventually found out. A team of engineers from Boeing and generals from headquarters arrived to investigate the unauthorized modifications. They inspected the Iron Maiden. They saw the welded spars, the truck springs, the solenoid trigger. The Boeing engineer looked at the setup, then looked at the combat reports. He looked at the 26 kill markings painted on the nose. He turned to the general. "Well," the engineer said, "it technically shouldn't work. The stress loads are too high. The weight distribution is wrong." But what?" the general asked. "But it works," the engineer replied. "And we should have thought of it first." Hank Miller was never court-martialed. He was never formally charged. But he was never given a medal for the design either. The military doesn't like to admit that a sergeant in a shed outsmarted the entire engineering department. However, the Miller mod didn't just stay in the field. The principles he proved, that heavy, forward-firing, power-operated armament was essential, were rushed back to the States. Within months, the new B-17G model began rolling off the assembly lines. Its defining feature? The Bendix chin turret. A remote-controlled, twin .50 caliber gun turret mounted directly under the nose, controlled by the bombardier. It was the factory-built version of the Devil's Teeth. It became the definitive look of the Flying Fortress, the chin that could take a punch and hit back harder. Hank Miller survived the war. He went back to fixing cars in Ohio. He rarely spoke about his time in the service. But every year, on October 14th, he would receive a card. No return address, just a postmark from wherever Arthur Reynolds or Marcus Bell were living. The card always said the same thing. "To the man who gave us our tomorrows." History books will tell you that the B-17G's chin turret was the result of engineering analysis and doctrinal evolution. They will show you blueprints drawn in Seattle. But the true origin of the Flying Fortress's final, most formidable evolution wasn't found on a drafting table. It was born in a cold, rainy hangar in East Anglia, welded together by a grieving friend who decided that the rules were worth breaking if it meant bringing his boys home. It was born from the insanity of the devil's teeth. And that is the story of how one man's disobedience changed the course of the air war, and how the B-17 finally earned its name.